Columbus, Ohio. The last Friday of March, 2006. Spring had barely arrived, but the night felt electric, that specific, restless electricity that only lives at the intersection of a Friday and youth and the promise of something undefined. The bars were full. The streets were loud. Thousands of people were exactly where they wanted to be. The short north, that narrow corridor of galleries, restaurants, and nightlife along High Street, pulsed with its usual weekend energy. Music poured out of open doors. Laughter echoed off brick walls. The city was alive in the way that only Friday cities can be. Nothing unusual. Nothing wrong. Somewhere in that crowd was a 27-year-old medical student named Brian Shaffer. He was with his friends. He was in good spirits. He had plans. Real plans, the kind that stretch forward into a life that feels full of possibility. He was, by every account, exactly where he wanted to be. And then he was gone. The Ugly Tuna Saloona. Ground floor of the Arena Grand Movie Theater Complex, on the corner of North High Street. A staple of Columbus bar culture, not elegant, not exclusive, just real. Neon signs. Sticky floors. The kind of place where a medical student could disappear into a crowd and feel invisible in the best possible way. Brian Shaffer entered those doors just after midnight on April 1, 2006. He was never seen leaving. To understand a disappearance, you have to first understand the person who disappeared. Not the mystery, the man. Because mysteries, left without human weight at their center, become puzzles. And Brian Shaffer was not a puzzle. He was a person. A specific, fully realized human being with a trajectory, relationships, and a future he was actively building. Brian Richard Shaffer was born on August 27, 1978, in Ohio. He grew up in Pickerington, a suburb east of Columbus, a quiet, respectable, unremarkable kind of American childhood in the best sense. He was, by all accounts from those who knew him, warm. Easy to be around. The kind of person who made people feel comfortable without working at it. By 2006, Brian was a second-year student at the Ohio State University College of Medicine. This was not a casual achievement. Medical school demands a particular combination of intelligence, discipline, and endurance, and Brian possessed all three. His academic record was strong. His professors noted his focus. His classmates knew him as someone who took the work seriously without taking himself too seriously. He had plans that reached far beyond Columbus. He and his long-term girlfriend, Alexis Walk, a fellow medical student, were planning a trip to Miami the following week. Spring break. A reward for the relentless grind of their first 2 years. They had talked about the future, about completing school, about where they might go next. The kind of conversations that assume there is a next. But the months preceding March 2006 had not been easy. In January of that year, Brian's mother, Linda Shaffer, had died after a long illness. Linda's death hit him deeply. Friends noticed a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Not depression, exactly, not dysfunction, but grief, which is its own specific gravity. Brian had been working through it the way people do. By continuing, by moving forward, by leaning on the people around him. His closest friend was Clint Florence. They had known each other for years, the kind of friendship built on thousands of small shared hours rather than dramatic moments. On the night of March 31st, it was Clint who Brian was with. They had planned a night out, a celebration of sorts, the end of the academic quarter, the coming of spring, the ordinary joy of being young and finished with a hard week. Brian called Alexis that evening before heading out. It was a normal call. Affectionate. Brief. He told her he loved her. He said he'd see her soon. Those were the last words she ever heard him speak. The evening of March 31st, 2006, began like any other Friday. Brian and Clint met up and began their night in the short north area, moving between establishments the way people do, casually, without urgency. They were drinking, but no one who saw them that night described either of them as visibly intoxicated. They were having a good time. They were present. At some point in the late evening, the two of them ended up at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a logical destination for any Friday night in their circle. The bar occupied a ground floor space in the Arena Grande complex, accessible from High Street via a set of escalators that led down into the venue. The layout is important. This detail will matter. Security cameras covered the main entrance, specifically the escalators that led into and out of the bar. This was standard practice. The cameras were functional. The recording was continuous. If you entered or exited through the main escalators, the camera saw you. This was the only way in or out, short of the emergency exits, which were alarmed and would have triggered a response if opened from inside. Brian and Clint arrived at the Ugly Tuna shortly before closing, around 1:55 a.m. on April 1st. Security footage captured them at the entrance. This is confirmed. They are visible on camera, together, entering the bar. And this is where the story, without warning, without drama, without any visible sign of what is about to happen, fractures. Inside the bar, Brian was seen talking to two women near the entrance area. This interaction was witnessed and later reported. He appeared relaxed. Normal. He was smiling. The women were strangers. No lasting significance has been attached to this conversation, but it establishes that Brian was present, conscious, social, and unalarmed. Clint moved through the bar. The two separated, as people do in crowded spaces. Neither of them was keeping close track of the other. Why would they? It was a normal night in a familiar place. Then Clint couldn't find him. Clint searched. He moved through the bar looking for Brian, checked the usual spots, asked around. Nothing. He waited. He assumed Brian had stepped outside, had found other people he knew, had wandered in the way people wander in bars. He wasn't alarmed. Not yet. He eventually left without Brian, assuming they'd just missed each other. The next morning, Brian wasn't where he was supposed to be. He hadn't come home. Alexis tried reaching him and couldn't. Clint tried. Nothing. By the time anyone realized something was genuinely wrong, an unknown amount of critical time had already passed. When investigators began reviewing the security footage, they were methodical. They pulled everything available, the main entrance cameras covering the escalators, footage from adjacent areas. They watched. They catalogued every person who came and went throughout the night. And here is what the footage showed: Brian Shaffer entering the bar. And here is what the footage did not show: Brian Shaffer leaving. Investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame. They confirmed that Brian was captured on camera entering the Ugly Tuna Saloona. What they could not find, no matter how many times they watched, was any footage of him leaving. He does not appear on the exit footage. He does not appear walking out through the front. He does not appear anywhere after that initial entry. The emergency exits were the only other option. 2 fire exits at the rear of the establishment, both alarmed. No alarm was triggered that night. No exit was reported forced. Nothing suggested that anyone left through those doors. The bar closed. Staff swept the premises. No one was found inside. Brian was not there when the lights came up and the chairs went on the tables. And yet he was not on any exit footage, either. This is the part of the story that investigators kept returning to. The math didn't work. You cannot enter a building without leaving it. You cannot cease to exist inside a room. And yet the footage, which captured everyone else who came and went, showed nothing. Brian Shaffer entered the Ugly Tuna Saloona at approximately 1:55 a.m. on April 1, 2006, and, by every piece of available evidence, he did not leave. He was simply gone. Columbus Police Department opened a missing persons investigation. This was not a slow process. The circumstances were unusual enough from the beginning that investigators recognized the case warranted serious attention. A young man, no history of wandering, no evidence of distress or danger, simply absent from a location he was confirmed to have entered. Detectives interviewed the people who had been with Brian that night. Clint Florence gave his account in full. The timeline of the evening, the arrival at the bar, the separation inside, the gradual realization that something was wrong. His account was consistent and credible. There was nothing in it that pointed to anything other than a normal night that had somehow become something else. The two women Brian had been seen speaking with near the entrance were identified. They corroborated his presence and his demeanor. He had seemed fine, relaxed. There had been nothing in his manner or his words to suggest fear, or urgency, or any intention of going anywhere other than deeper into his Friday night. The investigation spread outward from the bar. Surveillance cameras along High Street and the surrounding blocks were reviewed. Brian did not appear on any of them. He was not seen on foot, not seen getting into a vehicle, not seen anywhere in the vicinity of the bar after his entry. K-9 units were deployed. Searches were conducted in adjacent areas, including nearby construction sites and the Olentangy River. The broader Columbus area was searched. His family, his father Randy Shaffer, his brother Derek, cooperated fully with investigators and participated in efforts to locate him. They offered rewards. They kept the case in the public consciousness. They did everything right, and it changed nothing. Brian Shaffer had, by every investigative measure, ceased to exist. His bank accounts were never accessed after that night. His cell phone, which investigators tracked as best they could with 2006-era technology, showed no activity. He never used his credit cards. He never contacted anyone he knew. Not Alexis, not Clint, not his father, not his brother. He did not show up at the Miami airport the following week. He did not appear anywhere, ever, again. In 2008, the case went to the FBI. It is currently classified as an active missing persons investigation. No arrests have been made. No remains have been found. No explanation has ever been confirmed. The first theory, and in many ways the most structurally satisfying, if not the most comforting, is that Brian Shaffer died in an accident that night, and that his body ended up somewhere it has not been found. The most discussed version of this theory centers on construction. In 2006, the area around the Ugly Tuna Saloona was undergoing significant development. There were active construction zones in the immediate vicinity, open excavations, unstable terrain, areas of the site that were not secured or lit after working hours. A disoriented person, or even simply an unlucky one, navigating the area in the dark in the early hours of the morning, could have fallen into an excavation and been buried when construction continued. This theory gained significant traction because it explains what the surveillance footage cannot, that Brian left the bar through an exit that wasn't covered by cameras, perhaps a rear access point, a loading area, some gap in the coverage that has never been publicly identified, and that in his movement through the area, something went catastrophically wrong. It also explains the absence of the body. Construction sites are dynamic environments. Ground is moved, poured over, built upon. A body that entered an excavation in April 2006 could, depending on the specific location and the pace of development, now be beneath a foundation, beneath concrete, beneath the city itself. The theory is plausible. It is also, by its nature, essentially unprovable and undisprovable. You cannot search beneath buildings that now exist. What complicates this theory is the surveillance footage itself. The cameras showed everyone else leaving. Brian's absence from the exit footage is not explained by an alternative exit unless that exit genuinely existed and genuinely wasn't covered. Investigators who reviewed the footage were confident in their coverage. But confidence is not certainty. And certainty, in this case, has never been available. The second theory is the one that the word disappearance most naturally conjures, that something was done to Brian Shaffer. That he did not wander into misfortune alone, but was taken, or harmed, or made to vanish by another person or persons. This theory begins with the simplest observation. Brian had no known enemies. No conflicts, no debts, no involvement in anything that would make him a target in any obvious way. He was a medical student. He was liked. He was ordinary in all the ways that make you safe. But targets are not always chosen for reasons that make sense from the outside. Bars, late at night, are environments where violence is possible even when it isn't predicted. Wrong place, wrong moment, wrong convergence of strangers. Investigators found nothing to substantiate a foul play theory. No witnesses reported a confrontation. No blood was found on the premises. No one was ever identified as having interacted badly with Brian that night. The two women he spoke with described a normal, pleasant exchange. Nothing in his demeanor had suggested fear or conflict. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Investigators know this. But in this case, the absence extended so far and so completely that no credible foul play narrative has ever been constructed with any specificity. No person of interest was ever publicly identified. No lead was ever followed to anything substantial. If someone did something to Brian Shaffer, they did it without leaving a trace, without being seen, and without ever speaking about it in the nearly 2 decades since. The theory that attracts the most psychological complexity, and perhaps the most discomfort, is the possibility that Brian Shaffer chose to disappear. Voluntary disappearance, walking away from your life, deliberately, without telling anyone, is rarer than fiction suggests, but it happens. People do it for reasons that range from the catastrophic to the quietly desperate. Debt, mental health crises, the need to escape a life that has become unbearable, or simply the terrifying human impulse to become someone else. The case for this theory begins with Brian's emotional state in the months before he vanished. His mother had died in January. Grief is not a simple thing, and it doesn't follow a predictable timeline. What looks like recovery from the outside is not always recovery on the inside. There are people who argue that Brian's behavior that final evening, the warm phone call to Alexis, the ordinary socializing, is inconsistent with a man planning to walk away from his life. And this is a valid argument. But it is equally true that some people who choose to disappear do so suddenly, decisively, in a single moment of decision that surprised even themselves. The counter-evidence is powerful, however. Brian had a life he was visibly building. He had a relationship he spoke of warmly. He had a future he was actively planning for. The Miami trip was days away. He had no financial motive. No large cash withdrawals preceded the night. He had given no one any indication, in word or behavior, that he was considering leaving. And then there is the practical question. If Brian Shaffer walked away from his life in April 2006, he did so perfectly. Not a single confirmed sighting in nearly 2 decades. Not a single credit card transaction, not a single ATM withdrawal, not a single phone call. He either died that night, or he achieved a disappearance so complete that it has defied every technological and investigative effort to find him. The fourth theory is, in many ways, the most technically specific, and it is the one that investigators themselves have wrestled with most directly. It begins with a question. Is it possible that Brian Shaffer left the Ugly Tuna Saloona and simply was not captured on camera? Camera systems are not perfect. Coverage has angles, blind spots, moments of failure, gaps in recording that are not always apparent from the outside. The cameras at the Ugly Tuna covered the main escalator entrance. But how complete was that coverage? Were there positions within range of the exit that were outside the camera's field of view? Was the footage continuous, or were there gaps that have never been publicly disclosed? Some investigators and case analysts have pointed to the possibility of a camera positioning issue, that someone who was aware of the camera's angle, or who simply happened to move in the right way at the right moment, could have exited the bar in a manner that placed them outside the camera's captured frame. This would not require elaborate planning. It would require only that the exit happened in a specific physical location. If this is what occurred, it explains everything except one further question. Where did Brian Shaffer go once he left, and why has no trace of him appeared in the street footage from the surrounding area? To this question, there is no clean answer. The surrounding camera network in 2006 was less comprehensive than investigators might have hoped. There are streets, alleys, and routes where a person could have moved without being captured on any footage. It is possible. And possibility, in the absence of anything more definitive, is all that has ever been available. Let us return to what is known. Not what is theorized or suspected, but what is confirmed. Brian Shaffer was alive, present, and apparently well at approximately 1:55 a.m. on April 1, 2006. He was inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. He had been talking to 2 women near the entrance area. His demeanor was normal. That is the last confirmed moment. Everything after is reconstruction, inference, or absence. What happened in the minutes between that last sighting and the bars closing at 2 a.m.? The window is narrow, perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 10. Not long enough for much. Long enough for everything. Did he step outside for air and encounter something? Did he decide, in some snap of impulsive feeling, to leave without telling anyone? Did something happen to him inside the bar, in a space the cameras didn't cover? Did he walk through a door that led somewhere unexpected? The questions do not resolve. They only deepen. The bar closed. The lights came up. The staff swept through. The last customers filed out into the early hours of April 1st. Brian was not among them. He was not found inside when the sweep concluded. He was not on the exit footage. He was simply, and impossibly, gone. The years after Brian's disappearance have been defined, for the people who loved him, by the specific, exhausting work of not knowing. This is different from grief. Grief has an object, the knowledge of a loss, the terrible certainty of absence. What Brian's family and girlfriend faced was something else, an open question that could never be fully closed. Alexis Walk ultimately had to build a life without him, which she did, because she had no other choice. Clint Florence lived with the weight of the last night, the ordinary act of losing track of a friend in a bar, which had somehow become the last time anyone saw him. Randy Shaffer, Brian's father, became an advocate for his son's case, speaking publicly about the investigation, keeping the case in the media, refusing to allow Brian to become a forgotten file in a cold case drawer. The investigation has never been formally closed. The case remains active. Detectives assigned to the case have stated, in various interviews over the years, that they continue to follow up on credible leads. But the years have been unkind to the investigation in the way that time always is. Witnesses' memories fade, physical evidence degrades, people move, lives change. In 2014, a man named Duran Gonzalez was convicted of the murder of 2 women in Columbus and made a statement that he had been inside the Ugly Tuna on the night Brian disappeared. Investigators reviewed the connection seriously. No evidentiary link to Brian's disappearance was established, and Gonzalez was never charged in connection with the case. But the fact that such a man had been present that night, and that no one had known it until years later, only deepened the sense that the full story of that evening was more complex than the visible surface had ever suggested. The Ugly Tuna Saloona itself is no longer there. The space has changed, as commercial spaces do. The escalator, the entrance, the floor where Brian walked, they remain physically, but the context around them is different now. The bar that Brian entered no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Only the building does, and buildings don't remember. There is a specific kind of mystery that refuses to be solved. Not because it is too complex, not because the investigators were incompetent, not because the evidence was destroyed, but because something happened that left almost no trace. The kind of mystery where the absence itself is the only evidence. Brian Shaffer's disappearance is one of the purest examples of this kind of case that exists in the American true crime landscape. It has no body. It has no confirmed suspect. It has no definitive answer to even the most basic question. Is Brian Shaffer alive, or is he dead? The surveillance footage that should have answered the question, that should have shown, definitively, a man walking out of a bar, instead created the question. We see the entry. We don't see the exit. And in that gap between entry and exit, everything that might have happened to Brian Shaffer is equally possible and equally unverifiable. The theories each have weight. The accident theory explains the missing body and the missing exit footage. The foul play theory acknowledges the documented presence of at least one violent individual in the venue that night. The voluntary disappearance theory gives weight to the psychological complexity of a man in grief. The surveillance gap theory questions whether the cameras truly showed everything they might have. None of them is sufficient. All of them are plausible. The mystery sits in the center of all 4 possibilities and refuses to move toward any one of them. There is a quieter dimension to this case that deserves acknowledgement. Brian Shaffer was, as cases go, well covered. He was a young, educated man from a stable background whose family had the resources and the determination to keep his case in the public eye. He was photographed. He had a story that was documentable. And still, 20 years later, no one knows what happened to him. This quiet fact says something about the limits of investigation, of surveillance, of collective memory. In a world that increasingly tracks and catalogs everything, a person walked into a building and disappeared completely. The cameras were there. The investigators were competent. The family never stopped looking. And he was simply gone. Somewhere in the sequence of events between 1:55 a.m. and 2 a.m. on April 1, 2006, in a crowded bar in Columbus, Ohio, a young man named Brian Shaffer ceased to be visible to the world. He had entered a door. He had not exited a door. The space between those two facts, measured in minutes, in footsteps, in the length of a corridor or the width of a room, contains everything that has ever been unknown about his fate. His father Randy continued to advocate for the case for many years, determined to find answers, determined not to allow his son to become a statistical abstraction. That determination has kept Brian's story alive in ways that many missing persons cases are not kept alive. The story has been told and retold, and examined by investigators and amateur researchers and journalists and documentary makers, and still the center holds its silence. What happened to Brian Shaffer? The honest answer, the only answer that the evidence supports, is that no one knows. Not with certainty. Not with the kind of specificity that would allow a case to be closed, a family to find rest, a story to reach its ending. He entered a bar. The cameras were rolling. The exits were covered. The building was swept. And when the night was over, he was not there. He was simply, and impossibly, and completely gone.